In early 1956, Germany believed it had finally learned how to survive hardship. The war was a decade behind them. Cities were slowly standing back up, and families were beginning to trust the future again. Coal was rationed but available, trains were running, schools were open, and winter was expected to be uncomfortable, not deadly. No one imagined that within weeks, doors would freeze shut, rivers would turn into solid roads of ice, and entire neighborhoods would fall silent, not from fear of bombs, but from cold so deep it stole breath, strength, and hope. This was not a dramatic disaster announced by sirens or headlines. It arrived quietly night after night as temperatures kept falling beyond anything people had prepared for. Minus 20 degrees, then lower. Homes designed for survival suddenly felt like traps. Stoves burned empty faster than coal could be delivered. Pipes cracked like glass. Electricity failed without warning. And outside, the streets that once symbolized recovery became frozen corridors where even walking felt dangerous. What made this winter different was not just how cold it was, but how unprepared everyone truly was. Germany had rebuilt walls and roads, but it had not rebuilt resilience against nature. Families who believed hunger belonged to the past found themselves counting slices of bread again. Parents who promised their children warmer days ahead began making impossible choices between heating one room or saving fuel for the next night. In rural areas, farmers watched livestock freeze where they stood. In cities, elderly people were discovered days later in apartments that never warmed again. And yet, life did not stop. People still woke up every morning, layered clothing over fear, and stepped outside because survival demanded routine. Children walked to school through snow that swallowed their boots. Workers pushed broken bicycles when trains no longer came. Mothers stood in endless lines for coal that often never arrived. The cold did not scream, it waited. It crept into bones, into walls, into silence. Newspapers tried to reassure readers. Officials underestimated the danger. Weather reports spoke of extreme conditions, but words failed to explain what it meant to live inside a country slowly freezing. This winter would test more than infrastructure. It would test memory, endurance, and the fragile belief that the worst was truly over. And long after the snow melted, those who lived through it would remember one truth above all else. The war had taught them how to endure violence, but the winter of 1956 taught them how vulnerable peace could be. By February 1956, the cold was no longer a surprise. It was a daily threat. What began as an unusually harsh winter had turned into something far more dangerous, a slow, relentless freeze that wrapped itself around every part of life. Temperatures stayed far below zero for weeks, sometimes dropping so low that thermometers simply stopped working. Rivers like the Rhine and the Elbe thickened with ice, disrupting transport and isolating entire regions. Coal deliveries failed as rail lines froze and machinery broke down. Trucks could not start. Barges stood still in ice that looked solid enough to walk on. Inside homes, the cold felt personal. Walls radiated chill. Blankets were stacked in layers. Coats were worn indoors. And families crowded into a single room around small stoves that struggled to stay alive. Many households burned furniture, books, even wooden toys to keep a flame going for a few more hours. At night, people slept fully dressed, hats pulled down, breath visible in the darkness. Parents woke repeatedly to check if their children were still warm enough, knowing that sleep itself could be dangerous. Schools closed in some areas, not because of snow, but because classrooms could no longer be heated. In others, children were sent home after hours of shivering at their desks, fingers numb, ink freezing inside pens. Hospitals filled quickly, not with dramatic injuries, but with quiet emergencies: frostbite, pneumonia, exhaustion. Doctors worked in coats and gloves, making decisions under conditions that felt closer to wartime than peace. Elderly people suffered the most. Many lived alone, unwilling to ask for help, trusting that the cold would pass as it always had before. For some, it did not. Neighbors discovered frozen apartments only after days of silence. Outside, the streets told their own story. Bicycles lay abandoned, tires split by ice. Cars were pushed instead of driven if they moved at all. People walked slowly, carefully, afraid of falling because getting back up was never guaranteed. Yet amid all this, routines continued. Workers still showed up at factories that barely functioned. Shopkeepers opened doors even when shelves were nearly empty. Women stood in long, unmoving lines for coal or bread, knowing there might be nothing left by the time they reached the front. There was frustration, but also a strange calm, a shared understanding that complaining would not make the cold retreat. The government urged patience. Newspapers printed advice on how to survive freezing nights. Radios spoke of weather patterns and approaching change. But for those living inside it, the winter felt endless. This was not a single catastrophic moment, but a test of endurance stretched over weeks. Every day survived felt like a small victory. Every morning brought the same question: how long can this last, and how much longer can we hold on? As the winter dragged on, survival stopped being about planning and became about improvisation. By late February and early March, many families in Germany no longer asked when the cold would end. They focused on getting through the next 24 hours. Coal was scarce, and when it did arrive, it was often wet, low quality, or already promised to someone else. People learned quickly how to make a little heat feel like a lot. Doors were sealed with rags. Windows were covered with cardboard. Newspapers, anything that could block the wind. One room became the center of life. Cooking, sleeping, working, or compressed into a few square meters of shared warmth. Outside that room, the rest of the house might as well have been abandoned. Food followed a similar logic. Fresh supplies were rare, so meals were simple and repetitive. Soup was stretched thin. Bread was eaten slowly, each slice measured. Children were taught not to waste even crumbs, not out of discipline, but necessity. Mothers traded recipes in line, small tricks for making meals last another day. In villages, neighbors shared what little they had, knowing that refusing today might mean needing help tomorrow. In cities, community centers and churches opened their doors, offering warmth, hot drinks, and brief relief from the isolation of freezing apartments. These places became more than shelters. They were reminders that people were not facing the winter alone. Yet the emotional toll was heavy. The cold wore down patience, strength, and hope. Arguments flared over fuel, over food, over decisions that had no good answers. Parents hid their fear from children, while children sensed it anyway. Nights felt endless, marked by the crackle of dying fires and the sound of wind pressing against buildings. Some people began to lose track of time, days blending together in a rhythm of cold, work, sleep, and cold again. Still, there were moments of quiet resistance. Strangers helped push stalled cars. Workers shared gloves. Families took in relatives or neighbors who could no longer heat their homes. Children found ways to play in the snow, their laughter brief but real, cutting through the heaviness of the season. These small acts did not end the winter, but they made it survivable. Authorities eventually acknowledged the scale of the crisis, organizing emergency coal shipments and temporary shelters. But progress was slow. Nature was in control, and everyone knew it. The winter of 1956 did not defeat Germany in one dramatic blow. It tested people slowly, patiently, asking again and again how much they could endure. And as March approached, with rumors of slightly warmer air on the horizon, many wondered whether survival alone was enough, or whether the cost of enduring this winter would follow them long after the ice finally melted. By late March 1956, the ice began to loosen its grip. The rivers that had frozen solid slowly yielded to the warmth of the sun, and the streets became passable once more. Coal deliveries resumed, trains moved, and people could finally sleep without layers of clothing or the constant fear that the fire would die overnight. Yet even as the temperature climbed above freezing, the winter left its mark. Families counted what they had lost. Furniture burned, savings spent on fuel, neighbors who did not survive. Children remembered the nights spent huddled together, listening to parents' whispered fears, learning a lesson about endurance before they could fully understand it. Adults carried the guilt of survival, the weight of decisions that had no good outcomes. Which room to heat, which meal to ration, which neighbor to help first. And still there was a sense of quiet triumph. People had survived not because the government had saved them, or because nature relented early, but because they had leaned on one another, adapted, and refused to give in. Stories of bravery, ingenuity, and small acts of kindness spread through towns and cities alike. A woman who shared her last loaf of bread with a neighbor became a hero in memory. A man who risked walking miles on frozen rivers to deliver coal to the elderly was never forgotten. Communities, once fractured by war and scarcity, learned again the power of shared hardship. That winter, Germany discovered a new resilience, one not measured in factories rebuilt or borders redrawn, but in quiet perseverance in humanity prevailing over circumstance. In the years that followed, people told their children about 1956, not as a tale of suffering alone, but as a story of survival and hope, a reminder that even the coldest winter could not extinguish life or spirit. And while the snow eventually melted and warmth returned to homes, the memory of what it took to survive lingered like a shadow. It shaped behavior, strengthened bonds, and became a silent testament to endurance. Germany emerged changed, not defeated, but tempered by ice, hunger, and relentless nights. Those who lived through it carried both scars and lessons, understanding for the first time that peace and stability were fragile, and that true courage often went unnoticed, revealed only in small gestures. Sharing warmth, holding a child close, walking a mile to deliver firewood, refusing to surrender to despair. The winter of 1956 was over, but its imprint remained, a story not just of cold, but of humanity's capacity to endure, adapt, and hope, even when everything around seems frozen and impossible. It was a chapter that reminded the nation, survival is not always heroic in the ways history remembers, but it is heroic in the quietest, most persistent ways of all.